The tragic death of Chris Benoit and his family has raised many issues. Many people have a lot to say about someone they've never met, but someone they've admired for years. That doesn't mean they don't have a right to say what they feel, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong. Many people who knew him feel there's no way he would have done it. I personally am convinced he didn't do it. For 1.5 weeks now, I've studied this case, and there are many issues outstanding. Today I'm going to deal with just one issue. I'm going to examine briefly the case of someone who might have done it. This does not mean that they did it, but what it does mean is that it's a call for the police to examine whether they did it or not, and if they didn't, to rule it out as irrelevant. Many people have questioned the potential role of Kevin Sullivan in this tragedy. One of the people who is most outspoken and who has pointed this out most clearly is an ex-wrestler called Johnny Angel. He is now retired from wrestling, but he speaks very logically, very clearly, and in a very balanced way. He does not accuse Sullivan, but he does say that this is a possibility and should be examined. His point is very honest and very clear. We must get to the bottom of this We must get to the bottom of this murder. We must find out who did it. If it was Chris Benoit, then we must accept it. If it was somebody else, if it potentially could be somebody else, then it must be investigated. I will quote extensively from his argument, commenting on it as I go. He points out that these deaths have shocked the wrestling world, and he's pointed out that the police call it a double murder-suicide. But he questions it and asks, looking at many facts, whether it was. He points out that it's exactly 10 years since Nancy divorced Kevin Sullivan and married Chris Benoit. This is a fact. It's also a fact that it was scripted at that time, 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago, that his wife Nancy should have an affair, or at least appear to have an affair, with Chris Benoit, who was then a member of the Four Horsemen. Now this was a good angle, and it was entertaining. The only issue was, the acting became reality, and Chris and Nancy actually fell in love, and Nancy divorced Sullivan to marry Benoit. This was not about Benoit stealing a wife or anything. It was simply a matter of falling in love and moving on. Benoit then left the WCW to go to work for WWE, which was then known, of course, as the World Wrestling Federation, the WWF. Now it's a fact, and he's correct here, that Sullivan threatened Benoit and told him he would kill him. This is a very important point. This is well known within the wrestling world. As a wrestler before, Johnny Angel testifies to the fact that he did say he would kill him. Now whether Sullivan meant it, whether Sullivan was just joking, or whether Sullivan was just carrying on an act, we really don't know. But that was 10 years ago. Now, Johnny Angel argues that Sullivan is very calculative. He's a calculating person, a cold-hearted individual, says Johnny. And he points out that today, according to sources close to him, Kevin Sullivan is a high-ranking member of the Satanic Church. Whether he is or not, I really don't know, but this should be investigated. And he goes on to explain why it should be investigated. He says that the police need to consider the possibility that Sullivan carried out these gruesome murders in order to have his revenge, which is what Satanists live for. He argues that he could have entered the home with an accomplice or with many accomplices and held the Benoit family at gunpoint. He goes on to argue that Sullivan could have then bound up Nancy and made Benoit and his son watch as he strangled the life out of her. Now, whether he did or not, we really don't know. But, amongst many possibilities, this is a possibility. His point is that Sullivan could easily have entered the house. He could have come in as a person who was a previous friend of the family. He could have easily gone in, because he could have got in by contacting Nancy, and then, when Benoit was in the doctor's, it's quite possible that he came in and was even invited in by Nancy, who believed he was there just as a friendship, as a friend, or maybe to make a gesture of friendship. Maybe she trusted him and believed after 10 years that everything was over and that they could move on and just greet as friends. It's also possible, and many people have conjectured this, that Benoit, in the 2 or 3 weeks before his death, had been threatened extensively. Many fellow wrestlers say that he looked very worried and apprehensive, and could have been threatened and could have kept it to himself. Benoit was a very private man. He may not have even told his wife, because he didn't want to worry her. We don't know that, but it is possible that Sullivan came in, and it's possible that he did this. This needs to be investigated. What makes this possible is that, according to Johnny, he did threaten Benoit. Sullivan threatened Benoit and said he would kill him. What makes it possible is that Sullivan, knowing Nancy in the past, could have called her up suddenly and said, "I'm outside your house, I need to visit you on private matters, something that's troubling me." She might have trusted him, allowed him in the house, and at that point he could have come in with his accomplices, tied her up, and put the child in the bedroom. When Benoit returned from the doctor's, he could have faced Sullivan, who greeted him, while from behind his accomplices then smothered Benoit with chloroform or some substance and made him inactive. When Benoit came to, he could have already been tied up, and then, as Johnny argues, it is possible that Sullivan then killed his wife in front of him and then tortured Benoit for many, many hours before killing his son, and tortured him for even more hours, or equal number of hours, before he actually killed Benoit. That could be possible, we don't know, but it's certainly worth investigating. What makes it worth investigating are the threats. What makes it worth investigating is the fact that Benoit married Sullivan's wife, and Sullivan was not very happy about that. What makes it worth investigating is that Sullivan never had a child with Nancy, and Benoit did. What makes it worth investigating is that Benoit was increasingly becoming more and more successful, was about to win the ECW title to add to his whole array and collection of titles, and Sullivan certainly could have been jealous. Now, we don't know, nobody knows. But this is a police investigation, and we should not make an apology for the police investigating every aspect, including whether Sullivan did it. The motive is there. We need to investigate and make sure it didn't take place in that way. Conversely, it is very hard to work out the motive for Benoit. Why would Benoit want to kill his family? Why would Benoit, who loved his family, who spent hours and hours talking about his family, who travelled for 5 hours, for 4 hours, for 3 hours on a plane from events to come back just to be with his family for an hour, who talked to his own father about how much he loved his family only a week or so before the deaths on Father's Day, and said to his father, Michael Benoit, said to his father that he loved his family so much and that he wanted to spend more time with them. These are not the words of someone who's about to kill them. What motive would Benoit have for spending so many hours in between the deaths? What motive would Benoit have to suddenly become an alcoholic and go around drinking 10 cans of beer and all the wine? What motive would Benoit have to kill the precious son, the one he loved so much, the son who joined him together with his wife in the wrestling ring in WrestleMania 20, when he was so successful.